Welcome to a deep dive into Dostoevsky. You sent us some excerpts from like an introductory lecture, and we're going to unpack those to give you a good understanding of Dostoevsky's work and its relevance. We want you to walk away feeling well-informed, not overwhelmed.
Yeah. It's really amazing how Dostoevsky's work continues to resonate centuries later. He grapples with these deep questions of faith, morality, the human condition, and they just feel so relevant, even today.
Right. Like this lecture points out that he wasn't just a writer, but like he had to make a living. So he really had to appeal to a wide audience.
Right.
He couldn't be too obscure or too intellectual. So he had to find a way to make these complex philosophical ideas exciting. And I think he did that by using elements of mystery and suspense.
Yeah, exactly. Like he's writing these philosophical thrillers, and drawing readers into these complex narratives and making them think about these big ideas without them even realizing it. And I think that's part of what makes him feel so contemporary.
Yes. When you read Tolstoy, for example, it feels very much rooted in its historical context.
Right.
But Dostoevsky feels like he could be writing for us today.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. He's writing during this time of immense upheaval in Russia, right? The old order is crumbling, new ideas are emerging, and people are really grappling with anxieties about the future.
Right.
Sound familiar?
Yeah.
I mean, these anxieties about societal change, questioning faith, the rise of a new intelligentsia. I mean, these are all things that we're still dealing with.
Okay. So let's unpack this idea of like cultural change in Russia a little bit.
Okay.
This lecture mentions Peter the Great and his reforms back in the late 17th century and how that kind of created this cultural rift.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, Peter the Great forced the Russian elite to adopt Western thought. And this created this huge gap between the educated class, who were embracing these new ideas, and the peasantry, who remained very much rooted in traditional values.
And Dostoevsky really experienced this firsthand during his imprisonment.
He did. I mean, he was surrounded by all of these peasant convicts who looked at him and other educated prisoners with suspicion, resentment, even hatred.
Wow.
And that experience really deeply impacted him. And it really solidified his belief that Russia needed to find a way to bridge this gap.
Okay.
He really felt that respecting the religious values of the peasantry was absolutely crucial for social stability and harmony.
And this kind of sets the stage for that big intellectual debate between the Westernizers and the Slavophiles in the 19th century.
It does, yeah. And Dostoevsky's own position in this debate is really interesting and evolved over time. He initially aligned with the Westernizers, who believed that Russia should follow Europe's model of progress.
Okay.
But his views shift, and he becomes more sympathetic to the Slavophile emphasis on Russia's unique cultural identity and spiritual depth.
So he was kind of straddling both sides, trying to find some sort of middle ground.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's important to note that even as he embraced aspects of Slavophilism, he didn't shy away from criticizing their somewhat romanticized view of the Russian past.
Right.
He didn't idealize things like serfdom. He believed in progress, in freedom of speech, in the press, and he really advocated for land redistribution to the peasantry. He saw that as essential for social stability, something you see in his characters.
Okay. Let's get into Dostoevsky's early life. I mean, it's so interesting how his experiences really shape his writing. Right. He had this blend of privilege and hardship.
Growing up.
Right. He was born in 1821 into an educated family. His father was an army doctor who achieved noble status. His mother came from a merchant family. So they weren't destitute, but they weren't, landed gentry either. And you can see that sensitivity to social status reflected in his work.
Yeah. And his religious upbringing was pretty intense for a noble family at the time. It was. And that instilled in him a very profound sense of faith. That would be challenged later on by his experiences.
And speaking of challenges, there's that detail about his father's death, which is kind of haunting.
Yeah. The rumor that Dostoevsky's father was murdered by their own serfs.
Yeah.
It's pretty chilling. Freud even, analyzed this and suggested that it might have had, some subconscious impact on Dostoevsky's psychology.
Yeah.
And his exploration of themes like parricide.
Wow. So that's really intense. Okay, so let's move on to his early career. He achieved success pretty quickly with his first novel.
He does. Yeah.
And that introduces him to these influential figures like the critic Polinsky. And he also gets exposed to these radical circles that are getting traction at the time.
Right.
But even with this early success, he's not afraid to challenge the prevailing ideologies, like his very public break with Belinsky over atheism was a
Yes.
big deal.
That was a turning point for him.
Yeah.
Yeah, he rejected Belinsky's embrace of Feuerbach's idea of God as a human creation.
Yeah.
And instead embraced a more traditional view of faith.
Okay. So he's already showing his independent spirit,
Yes.
even as a young writer. And then he gets involved with this group called the Petreski Circle,
Right.
which was this hotbed of progressive, revolutionary ideas.
The Petreski Circle was a group of
Yeah.
young intellectuals who were meeting and discussing these really radical ideas that were sweeping across Europe.
Okay.
And while Dostoevsky was passionate about, social change, he was also wary of socialist programs
Right.
that he felt would compromise individual freedom.
So this internal conflict, desire for change, but also a concern for individual liberty
Yes,
is something we see throughout his work.
absolutely. And it's important to remember that despite his, intellectual disagreements with socialists, Dostoevsky was completely opposed to serfdom. He even joined a secret revolutionary society within the Petreski Circle that was actively working
Yeah.
to overthrow the system.
Yeah. That was risky business.
It was.
That brings us to one of the most dramatic chapters in his life, his arrest in 1848,
Right.
and that mock execution.
The entire Petreski Circle is arrested, and Dostoevsky endures a year of solitary confinement before being let out to face a firing squad.
Oh, my God.
And at the last minute, his sentence is commuted to hard labor in Siberia.
Wow. Can you imagine the psychological impact of that?
It was a profound turning point for him.
Yeah.
I mean, really solidified his faith. And it led to this dramatic shift in his worldview.
And out of that experience came House of the Dead,
Yes.
which is one of his most powerful works, but often overlooked.
It is. It's this raw and powerful account of his prison years. Even Tolstoy praised it as a masterpiece. House of the Dead offers incredible insight into his evolving worldview and his deep empathy for those who suffer.
Okay. So to understand his work more deeply, it helps to understand the literary landscape that he was working in. Russian literature had gone through this major transformation after Peter the Great.
It had, yeah. Writers began to embrace European literary styles and models. Pushkin, for example, drew inspiration from figures like Byron and Shakespeare, while still creating works that felt, distinctly Russian in their themes and characters.
So there's like this balancing act between absorbing these outside influences
Right.
and forging their own Russian identity.
Exactly. And then you have Belinsky, who champions this idea of social realism in literature.
Okay.
He was urging writers to engage with the pressing social issues of their time.
And this brings us to Gogol,
Yes.
whose work, especially Dead Souls and The Overcoat,
Yeah.
really embodied that spirit.
Yeah. Belinsky was a huge advocate for Gogol. And Dostoevsky, who was already a fan of Balzac and Gogol, took this approach even further. He was really fascinated by the inner lives of ordinary people. And instead of simply satirizing social ills, like Gogol did, he delved into the psychology, or an emotional reality of the characters that society often overlooks.
Right.
And you see that in even his early work, Poor Folk.
Okay. And then there was this trend at the time, these physiological sketches
Yes.
that were really popular.
Yeah, these were like these literary snapshots of everyday life, often focusing on the lower classes. Dostoevsky, though, went beyond simple observation.
Yeah.
He imbued these portraits with humanity and empathy, really elevating them beyond simple sketches.
Before we dive into Poor Folk, I think it's worth exploring some of the other literary influences that shaped that early work, especially Karamazov and, of course, Pushkin.
Right.
Because they're both essential to understanding not only Poor Folk, but also his broader approach to storytelling.
Absolutely. I mean, Dostoevsky isn't just drawing on personal experiences.
Right.
He's engaging with the cultural and intellectual currents of his time.
It's like he's leaving us clues, almost like these Easter eggs, to enrich our understanding of his narratives.
Yeah.
It's like he wants us to see his characters not just as individuals, but also as representations of these larger social and philosophical struggles that are playing out in Russia at the time.
Exactly. It adds these layers of meaning
Yeah.
to the stories.
Okay, so let's start with Karamazov, who I think is not as well known outside of Russia,
Right.
but he was incredibly influential
Right.
at the time.
He was this prominent writer, historian, and critic
Yeah.
known for these sentimental stories, like Poor Liza. And he also wrote this. very influential history of Russia, which championed Tsarism.
Huh.
And Dostoevsky, like many of his generation, grew up reading Karamazov.
Yeah.
And his early work, Poor Folk,
Yes.
really echoes themes
Yeah.
Karamazov's Poor Liza.
Uh-huh.
Both stories center around the plight of the lower classes,
Mm-hmm.
exploring these themes of love, poverty, social injustice.
But even though they share these thematic similarities, Dostoevsky takes this much more realistic, less sentimental approach.
Right.
He's not romanticizing poverty.
Right, where Karamazov is idealizing his characters and setting. Dostoevsky presents a much more gritty and unflinching portrayal of poverty and suffering. I mean, he wants you to really feel the weight of it, the desperation, the struggle.
And then, of course, there's Pushkin,
Yes.
who was Dostoevsky's lifelong literary idol.
Yeah, he revered Pushkin, even going so far as to say that Pushkin was as great as Shakespeare
Yeah.
or Goethe.
Wow.
His influence on Dostoevsky is undeniable.
And in Poor Folk, we see these really interesting parallels to Pushkin's short story, The Station Master.
Right.
And both stories explore this theme of, the vulnerability of the lower classes.
Exactly. In Pushkin's story, the station master's daughter is seduced and taken away by this wealthy nobleman.
Oh, wow.
And the station master's left, utterly devastated. And this sense of social injustice and this exploitation of the powerless is very central to Poor Folk as well.
Okay, let's circle back to Gogol and his story, The Overcoat, because that story had a huge impact on Dostoevsky, particularly in terms of focusing on these seemingly insignificant individuals, these little men, as they're called, who are trapped in these bureaucratic systems.
Yes. In The Overcoat, Gogol introduces us to Akaky Akakevich, a lowly clerk whose entire life revolves around his work.
Uh-huh.
And he's this classic little man, living this mundane, almost pathetic existence. But when he gets a new overcoat, it transforms his life.
Okay.
It gives him this sense of dignity and social standing that he's never had before.
But of course, this newfound happiness is short-lived.
Right. Tragically, his prized overcoat is stolen. And when he pleads for help from the authorities, he's met with this utter indifference, even cruelty.
Wow.
And he ends up dying, heartbroken and defeated.
And then there's that fantastical ending where these phantoms start stealing overcoats from all the prominent people in the city.
Right. So Gogol uses this element of satire to expose the absurdity and the callousness of the bureaucratic system.
Yeah.
He's highlighting this utter indifference of those in power towards the suffering of the less fortunate.
Right.
And that's a theme that clearly resonated with Dostoevsky.
Okay, so in a way, Dostoevsky takes this idea of the little man from Gogol, combines it with this kind of social pathos from Pushkin, and creates Poor Folk.
He does. And what sets him apart is his choice of narration.
Okay.
He doesn't use a detached upper-class narrator like you see in Gogol and Pushkin.
Yeah.
Instead, he allows us to experience the world of Poor Folk from within, through the voices of the characters themselves.
So it's like he's inviting us to step inside that overcoat.
Yeah.
And see the world.
Through
the eyes of the marginalized.
Exactly. And that's just the beginning.
Yeah.
Dostoevsky takes this foundation and builds upon it, creating this incredible body of work that is both deeply personal and universally resonant.
So we've covered a lot of ground already. Dostoevsky's life was a whirlwind of influences and experiences, and it's clear that these all shaped his work. But to really appreciate his genius, we need to explore those major works where his ideas about suffering, redemption, and the human condition really come alive.
I agree. And while we're delving into those, let's think about how Dostoevsky's own brush with death, that mock execution, might have shaped his understanding of human suffering and the possibility of redemption. Those themes are at the very heart of his greatest works, and exploring them will reveal even more about his enduring relevance today.
Absolutely. So join us next time as we continue our deep dive into the captivating world of Fyodor Dostoevsky. Welcome back to our deep dive into Dostoevsky. Last time we were talking about how his narrative style really pulls you into the story. It makes you feel like you're right there, experiencing the world alongside his characters.
Yeah, it's true. Like you really feel their joys and sorrows, their struggles.
Yeah. And this brings us to Poor Folk, his first major work. And the lecture mentions how it's kind of a response to Karamazov's Poor Liza. Right.
But with a much more realistic edge. It's like he's taken that same theme of the vulnerable lower classes,
right,
but stripping away the sentimentality.
Yeah. He's not interested in romanticizing poverty. He wants to show it to you as it is, raw and real.
Okay, so how does he do that? Like, what makes poor folks so different?
Well, it's told through these letters, this correspondence between Makar Devushkin, he's a poor copyist,
Yeah.
and Varvara Dobrslova, this young woman who's struggling to survive in St. Petersburg. And their letters really become this window into their inner lives, their hopes, their fears, the realities that they're facing every day.
Yeah, it's almost like reading someone's diary.
Right.
You're getting this really intimate glimpse
Yeah.
into their thoughts and emotions.
Exactly. And remember, this was a time when, depicting the lives of ordinary people in such a raw, unfiltered way was pretty radical.
Yeah.
Most literature at the time focused on the upper classes. There are dramas, there are romances. Dostoevsky shines a light on those who are, often ignored by society. Yeah. He's giving a voice to the voiceless.
Yeah.
And really forcing us to confront these social inequalities of his time, which in many ways still resonate today.
Absolutely. And he does it with incredible psychological depth, too. Dostoevsky's characters aren't just these types or caricatures.
Right.
They're fully realized people with these complex inner lives.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes them so relatable, even today.
And this lecture also points out the influence of Gogol on poor folk.
Yes.
Especially that idea of the little man struggling within a system that's basically indifferent to his suffering.
Right. Like we talked about Gogol's The Overcoat earlier.
Right.
And how Akakievich is this, really tragic figure. He's a cog in this bureaucratic machine defined by his social status. And Dostoevsky builds on that idea in poor folk. Devushkin, the copyist.
Yeah.
He's also trapped in this cycle of poverty and social insignificance.
So both Akaki and Devushkin are kind of these little men.
They are, yeah.
But how does Dostoevsky take this concept further?
Well, he goes deeper into Devushkin's psychology. I mean, he explores his feelings of shame, his really desperate attempts to maintain some kind of dignity, even as he's constantly being reminded of his position in society.
Yeah.
It's really heartbreaking.
Yeah.
But so insightful.
I mean, through Devushkin, Dostoevsky isn't just critiquing the system that creates these little men.
Right.
But he's also forcing us to see their humanity, their struggles, their inner lives. It's a theme that he returns to again and again in his work. But it's so powerful in poor folk.
It is. And, while social commentary is, a huge part of it, poor folk is also a powerful exploration of compassion. Devushkin's love for Varvara, despite their differences, really shows the power of human connection, even in the darkest of circumstances.
Yeah, that's a great point. Even in the midst of suffering and poverty.
Right.
Dostoevsky reminds us that hope and empathy can still exist.
Yeah, he never lets you forget that, the potential for good in humanity. And this brings us back to the idea of suffering and redemption, which is so central to Dostoevsky's work.
Right.
Especially after his own near-death experience.
Right. That mock execution, it must have really forced him to confront not just the depths of human suffering, but also the possibility of finding meaning in it.
Yeah, it did. And you see that reflected in his novels. They're not about finding easy answers or simplistic moralizing. His characters are flawed. They make terrible choices. They struggle. But through their struggles, you see these glimmers of transformation, of finding grace, even in the chaos.
So his novels are kind of like these explorations of this question. How do we make sense of suffering? Can we find redemption, even in the face of despair?
Exactly. And it's not just about individual redemption. It's about societal redemption as well.
Yeah.
Remember how Dostoevsky was so critical of serfdom and he believed in social change?
Right.
He didn't think that change could come solely from political systems or ideologies. He thought it had to come from a deeper change within the human heart.
Yeah, he believed that the potential for good existed even in the most hardened criminals.
Right.
Even those who had committed terrible acts.
He did. And that belief in the inherent goodness of humanity, even in the face of darkness, is what makes his work so powerful and enduring. It's a message that's maybe more relevant than ever today.
We've talked a lot about Dostoevsky's big ideas, his philosophies.
Right.
But we can't forget that he was also
absolutely
the brilliant storyteller.
His novels are page-turners. They're filled with suspense, intrigue, these unforgettable characters, amazing plots.
Right.
You're on the edge of your seat, wondering what's going to happen next.
Right. He uses those elements of mystery and thrillers, what we were talking about earlier, to draw you in, and then, bam, he hits you with these really profound philosophical themes.
It's a great combination.
It is.
He's a true literary giant, able to blend, intellectual depth with this incredible narrative skill. Now, this lecture focuses mainly on, poor folk and Dostoevsky's early life, but to really understand his impact, his legacy,
Right.
we need to talk about his later works.
We're talking about masterpieces like Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, The Brothers Karamazov.
Yes.
I mean, those novels take his ideas about suffering, redemption, and the human condition to a whole new level.
They do. They are complex, they're challenging, but ultimately they're so rewarding, and they will stay with you long after you finish reading.
So are you ready to dive into the heart of Dostoevsky's literary universe?
Let's do it. I mean, in our final part, we'll explore those later works.
Yeah.
And we'll see how they grapple with these timeless questions that Dostoevsky raised, over a century ago. And still resonate deeply with us today.
Welcome back to our Dostoevsky deep dive. We've come a long way, from those early influences to his groundbreaking debut with Poor Folk. But now, it's time to explore those later masterpieces, where his ideas about suffering, redemption, and the human condition really take center stage, ready to tackle Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, and The Brothers Karamazov.
Let's do it. I think what's so captivating about these books is how Dostoevsky takes these grand philosophical questions and he embeds them within these gripping narratives. It's not abstract. It's lived experience. You see these characters wrestling with their own demons, the complexities of existence, and it just pulls you in.
You can't really talk about Dostoevsky without talking about Crime and Punishment.
Right.
I mean, it's like the ultimate psychological thriller, but with this added layer of philosophical depth.
Yeah, the story of Raskolnikov, this impoverished student who commits this murder and then grapples with the, psychological and moral consequences. It's just masterful, suspenseful, but also this profound exploration of guilt, punishment, and the possibility of redemption.
And the way Dostoevsky takes you inside Raskolnikov's mind and exposes his justifications for the crime, his arrogance, his descent into paranoia and despair. I mean, it's unsettling, but also incredibly insightful. I felt like I was experiencing it right alongside him.
Yeah. And you can't forget Porfiry Petrovich.
Oh, yeah.
The investigator. He's not just a detective trying to solve a case. He's like this philosophical sparring partner for Raskolnikov. He challenges his ideas, pushes him to really confront his conscience.
Yeah. Their conversations are like intellectual chess matches, full of tension and these subtle power plays. It's like Dostoevsky staging a battle between two different worldviews.
It's brilliant. Now, The Idiot explores this idea of radical goodness. Through the character of Prince Mishkin, he's almost this Christ-like figure, this innocent soul who enters this world of cynicism, greed, social climbing.
Yeah. It's like he sees the good in everyone.
He does.
Even those who are, kind of cast aside by society, labeled as idiots or outcasts.
Exactly. But that innocence is also kind of curse, Mishkin's.
Yeah.
Inability to grasp the darkness of the world around him leads to these tragic consequences.
Yeah.
He disrupts the established order, exposes their hypocrisy, and ultimately he becomes a victim of the very society he's trying to heal.
It's heartbreaking, but it makes you think about the nature of compassion, the limits of innocence, and how difficult it is to hold on to faith in a world that often rewards cruelty and deception. I mean, would you consider Mishkin a tragic hero?
I think that's a great question. I think he definitely embodies that idea of the tragic hero, someone whose virtue leads to their downfall. It really makes you wonder if true goodness can even survive in a world so corrupted by self-interest and ambition.
And that kind of leads perfectly into The Brothers Karamazov, which is often considered to be his masterpiece.
It is, yeah.
This epic exploration of faith, doubt, free will, and really the meaning of life.
It's like he poured everything into this book, his philosophical insights, his psychological brilliance, his mastery of storytelling, and his deep empathy for humanity. It's all there.
The Karamazov family is so fascinating. You've got the father, Fyodor Pavlovich, this tyrannical figure who really casts this shadow over his sons, Dmitri, the passionate one, Ivan, the intellectual and skeptic, Alyosha, the devout novice, and then Smerdyakov, this illegitimate son, shrouded in mystery.
Right.
I mean, each brother represents a different facet of human nature, a different response to the complexities of life.
And then you have the murder of their father,
right,
which sets off this whole chain of events and forces each brother to really confront his own beliefs. and his choices.
Yeah, I think one of the most compelling parts of the Brothers Karamazov is its exploration of these different forms of faith. You see Alyosha's unwavering belief, Ivan's tormented doubt, Dmitri's struggle to find redemption through suffering. They're all wrestling with this question of God, what it means for their lives.
And then there's that Grand Inquisitor chapter.
Yes.
With Ivan's vision of this world where the church offers comfort and security in exchange for freedom. It's such a powerful critique of institutionalized religion.
Yeah.
And its potential for corruption. Have you ever read anything that just shook you to your core?
Yeah.
The Grand Inquisitor chapter did that for me.
Yeah, it's such a chilling and unforgettable chapter. It challenges you to think about the foundations of faith and who really holds power in a world where belief is controlled. But Dostoevsky doesn't give us easy answers, does he?
He doesn't.
He presents us with these competing perspectives and forces us to wrestle with them, the complexities of faith, of doubt, and our own search for meaning.
He just makes you think. And I think that's what makes his work so enduring. His concerns are just timeless. The questions he raises about the nature of good and evil, the search for meaning, the tension between faith and doubt, I mean, they're still so relevant.
Yeah.
His characters aren't just 19th century Russians. They're reflections of ourselves and the challenges we face.
And even in the darkest corners of the human soul, he reminds us that there's this possibility for compassion, for change. It's something to hold on to.
Absolutely. And, you know, his insights into human psychology are just as relevant today as they were back then. I mean, he captures the nuances of thought and emotion with incredible precision. And even though his world was vastly different from ours, the core struggles of his characters feel so familiar.
So, as you continue to explore Dostoevsky's works, think about this. How did his own background, straddling these different social classes, shape his portrayal of those living on the margins? How did his evolving views on Russia's place in the world, between Westernization and Slavophilism, influence his narratives? Think about it.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Fyodor Dostoevsky. We hope this has been insightful and that it sparks a desire to explore his works even further.
Until next time, happy reading and keep diving deep.